Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Guns and Guitars, and I realized something last week when I was showing you guys how you can make a custom high-end bass neck using basic DIY tools and wood from Home Depot, that it's been a while since I've done a video on my updated method for perfect fretwork. And I showed you guys some of these tricks that I'm going to show you in this video today in my live stream community build, and a lot of you guys noticed in that tutorial that I had a few tricks up my sleeve that I hadn't previously shared with you. And so I thought it would be a good idea to kind of go all the way back to the beginning and show you guys my complete, fast, foolproof method for perfect fretwork. I'm Dan, this is Guns and Guitars, let's get started. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are going to be performing these steps on a prefabricated neck like this one. This is a neck that I just ordered in a bundle from China for this round of pre-orders, and they're not always perfect. And so I'm going to give you a few tips as we go along about how you can sort of compensate for some of the errors in these pre-made necks. Now, if you're interested in making your own neck so you don't have to deal with that, definitely check out my video series from last week. It's a two-part series on how to build your own neck with basic DIY tools and lumber from Home Depot. And that will get you a way better start than buying one of these imported necks. But like I said, if you're just doing work on an existing instrument that you already have, or a kit that you bought, or if you already purchased a prefabricated neck, go ahead and start right here with these steps. The first thing that we want to do is make sure our neck is perfectly straight, and you need a notch straight edge for this. And I've shown you a couple of times in previous videos how you can make your own, but essentially just buy yourself a cheap straight edge, make sure that it is perfectly straight, compare it to a known flat surface, and then measure and mark and cut notches out for your frets. Then you're going to use this tool and adjust your truss rod until your neck is perfectly flat all the way across and side to side. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky with cheap prefabricated necks, is that sometimes you can't get it perfectly flat all the way across the whole width of the neck. And if that's the case, it's because you have a slight twist in your neck, or maybe your fingerboard was not perfectly flattened before they finished construction of your neck. In either case, try to get it so the majority of your neck is flat, and if there's any part that isn't, err on the side of a slight back bow. And the reason is that way you don't end up taking off too much of your front frets if you had a slight forward bow. If you have a slight back bow, you're going to end up taking off more from the middle section than from the two ends, and we will fix the back end a little bit later. But if you're going to have any frets that sit a little bit taller than the others, you're going to want those to be the frets up here. So once you're perfectly flat, or as close as you possibly can with maybe just a slight back bow, it's time to level the frets. And for this, I actually made myself a new tool. In the past, I've used a leveling beam like this. This is just a piece of aluminum T with some adhesive-backed 400 grit sandpaper, and this is awesome. This will get the job done 100%. It's just a little bit slow, especially when I'm dealing with prefabricated necks that are just not very level. Sometimes I have to hog off a lot of material from the frets, and this just takes a long time. So I ended up making myself this four-sided leveling beam. As you can see, this one is much longer too, so it's a lot more productive. This is 36 inches long, which is honestly probably a little bit too long. I may cut it down eventually. But what this is just a piece of aluminum square bar that I got at my local hardware store. I paid $11 for it. It's 3 feet long, 1 inch square aluminum tubing. And I just made sure that all four sides were perfectly flat. So I went to my known flat surface. I talked about this in my video series last week, how helpful it is to have a known flat surface in your workshop, whether it's a workbench that you know is perfectly flat, or a granite countertop, or a concrete slab, or something that you know is perfectly flat. Check it with your straight edge to make sure. And then I just ran this across some sandpaper on that surface to make sure that all four edges were perfectly flat and level. And after that, I did the masking tape and super glue method, along with some 1 inch strips of various grits of sandpaper. So on here I have, and I labeled them so I knew which ones are which. I have 150 on this side, then it goes up to 240, then 320, and then 600. And the reason why it jumps from 320 to 600 is because I already have 400 on this one right here. Now, honestly, for leveling frets, you're never going to use the 150 grit setting. I have that on there for leveling out other stuff. But to use this tool effectively, the first thing we need to do is mark all of our frets on the top with some Sharpie. And I've actually found that using colored Sharpie is a much better method than using black Sharpie. Black Sharpie oftentimes just looks like reflections, and it's kind of hard to tell if the Sharpie is still there or if you're just seeing a reflection of something dark in your frets. And so I've started using brown or red. It's a lot easier for my eyes to differentiate between reflections and the Sharpie having a nice differentiating color on there. And then I start with the 400 grit sandpaper as I normally would. And I just run it across the full length of all of the frets, making sure to evenly go back and forth across the radius so as to not mess up the radius of the frets. And after that, I stop and check to see where I've taken off Sharpie and which frets are still too low. And I will reevaluate if I need to go down to a more productive grit sandpaper. And on this neck, I did need to come down quite a bit more. So I actually went down to 320 and I tried it again. And I still found some frets that were still a bit too low. So I went down to 240, and 240, you have to be really careful because you can take off a lot of fret really fast. So I went down to 240 just for a few swipes, and I got all of our frets down level. And then what I did after that is I went back to 400 and took all the gouges that were left from the 240 grit sandpaper, and then I went up to my 600 grit, and I just very lightly pretty much just polished the very tops of the frets. And this is just gonna save me a little bit work polishing later by removing some of those scratches that were even left by the 400 grit sandpaper. And you'll notice once I get to the 600 grit that I also am going side to side. And the reason why I finish side to side with the 600 grit is because that'll let me know if I've truly removed all of the tool marks from the other grits, as well as make it a lot easier to polish out the scratches when it comes to our polishing time. And if we do end up with any marks, I would rather them be side to side because that's going to interfere a lot less with pitch bends and stuff than if they were perpendicular to the fret. And once I get to this stage, then it's time to pull out the fret rocker and check to make sure all of our frets sit perfectly level and do any touch-ups if there are some that somehow escaped the leveling process. And in this case, I did have some that escaped. And so I not only mark the fret that is a little bit taller than the others, but actually mark the frets surrounding it so that when I go back to level again, I know when I've brought that middle fret down level with the frets surrounding it. And then I will go back to the 400 grit. Again, we're not trying to take off a lot of material here. And so just starting with 400 grit, and once it's down level, 600 grit side to side, and check again with the fret rocker. This is the fret rocker that I'm using in this video. It's the Crimson Guitars fret rocker. I'm using this one just because they sent it to me and it works awesome. But you guys know, if you've seen my previous fretwork videos, that you can actually make a fret rocker just out of an old credit card, or really, honestly, out of any piece of aluminum or steel. All you got to do is make sure that you flatten it on a perfectly known flat surface, as I mentioned before. Now, once you're confident that you have completely leveled all of your frets, we are going to add our 12th fret fall off or our 12th fret taper, depending on whatever terminology you want to use. When a string vibrates, it's a conical vibration with the widest point being at the very center of the string. So when we're setting up our bass, we're going to add a little bit of neck relief at the 12th fret, so that compensates for the extra vibration of the string right there. But in addition to that, we also want the frets to taper off beyond the 12th fret. That way the string can still sit as close to the frets as possible without having any fret buzz. So to do this, I put some masking tape to cover all the frets above the 9th fret, and then I put an extra couple layers of masking tape on the 9th fret itself. Then I add the Sharpie back to every single fret from the 9th all the way to the 24th in this case, because it's a 24 fret neck. And then I essentially just repeat the leveling process. And again, I'll start with 400 grit sandpaper, and if it feels like I need to be more productive, I will go to my 4-sided leveling beam and go to a more productive grit. Now, the reason why I've started taping off at the 9th fret as opposed to the 12th fret is that I found that at the 12th fret, the extra couple layers of masking tape made my fall off just a tad too steep, and I found that I was just really sawing away at those upper frets, especially on a 24 fret neck. I was just removing too much material, and it just wasn't necessary. So putting it at the 9th fret does a little more shallow angle, and then as the sandpaper rubs against the masking tape, it'll slowly kind of remove some of that masking tape, which will kind of cause our fall off to kind of roll off flat again. And I've actually found that that's perfect, because when we adjust the neck relief of our neck, we're not just going straight and then all of a sudden an angle at the 12th fret. It's going to be more of a bow shape. And so since it's kind of like a bell curve, what we want is our frets to kind of follow that that similar curve shape. And so I found that this method gets me the best results. And honestly, at this step, you don't need to remove the Sharpie all the way up to the 9th fret. Removing Sharpie up to the 12th fret is actually good enough. And so once you're satisfied at that point, then we'll actually take the tape off and then just do one quick pass with the 600 grit. And we're gonna kind of roll the beam across the full length of the neck. And again, that's just gonna help us kind of taper a sort of curve on our frets the whole length of the fretboard. And again, end with 600 grit side to side. So if we leave any tool marks, they are going to be parallel with the frets. Now, the reason why I'm calling this video the fast foolproof method is because if you follow the steps that I did to a T, at this point, your frets should be perfect and ready to be crowned and polished. And the reason why it's fast is because using the heavier grits of sandpaper help you to be more productive. So typically up until this point, it would take me about 20 minutes if I was doing the whole thing only on 400 grit sandpaper. And this way, I'm able to do it in half the time. It takes me about 10 minutes to do my initial leveling and my taper or fall off. And not only that, because I end on the 600 grit, it actually makes the polishing step go a lot faster too once we get to that step. Now, when it comes to fret crowning, I have a new fret crowning file that I absolutely adore. And this is my secret to getting really fast, perfect fret work. This is the Dagger 2.0 from Fret Guru. And this file is absolutely incredible. It's extremely productive. It leaves barely any tool marks, which is shocking for how productive it is. And most importantly, it has extremely smooth edges that will not mark up your fingerboard. So you don't need to worry about using a fretboard guard with this. And this file right here is the reason why I'm calling this the foolproof method for perfect fret work, because it really takes all the guesswork out of it. Now, in the past, you guys have seen me use a Baroque fret file. This is the Gen 4 four-sided file. It's got 3 different size fret files as well as a flat file. If you purchase this file on my recommendation, don't feel bad. It's still an excellent fret file, and I don't think you would have any reason to upgrade. This file will run you about $40, where the Dagger 2.0 will actually, it used to be $40. Now I think it's gone up to about $60, which is still like half the price of a StewMac Z file. And I can't imagine a Z file would work any better than this, as I'm going to demonstrate for you right now. So now that we've flattened out a bunch of our frets, we need to crown them back into a dome shape. So you guessed it, time to mark all the tops with Sharpie again. And this is where the Dagger 2.0 from Fret Guru really makes this process foolproof, because the crowning files on this thing are just perfectly shaped. All you got to do is just use the weight of the file. You don't have to use really any pressure, and just go back and forth across the fret, and it will leave you with a perfect crown all the way across. And you'll know it's perfect because you'll see just a super tiny sliver of a line of Sharpie left. You don't want to go all the way till you remove all the Sharpie. And honestly, this file makes that extremely difficult to do. And what this tool really excels at is if I have a part of the fret that's a little bit flatter than the others, all I do is put my finger across the top of it on the area that I need to crown a little bit more, and it makes it a lot more accurate in crowning just a small portion of a fret. And after I've got my fret with just that teeny little skinny line of Sharpie on it, I actually use this also to dress the fret ends, okay? And it really negates the need for having a fret dressing file as well. Because if I just take the crowning file and I run it at like a 45-degree angle and kind of slowly rock up onto the fret, then that rounds out and dresses the fret ends, removing any of those real sharp edges. Now, I do recommend with any fret file, the Baroque file, the Fret Guru file, or the Z file, you do want to keep a wire brush on hand and just kind of knock off any metal shavings between each fret. That will just keep your file nice and clean and working productively, because you won't have any metal shavings getting packed in those file grooves. Now, the steps that I just showed you with the Dagger 2.0 can be done with the Baroque Gen 4 as well. It's just a little bit less productive, so it's going to take you a little bit longer. What used to take me 30 to 40 minutes to crown and round over the edges of the frets with the Baroque file now takes me about 20 to 30 minutes with the Fret Guru file. Now, once you've crowned all of your frets and you've rounded off both sides of every fret, you may run your hands down and still feel a little bit of sharp edges. And that's because the file didn't remove any of the sharpness on the center of the edge of the fret. It only rounded off the corners. And so what I do to knock down that little bit of sharpness is I just take a sponge with some 320 grit sandpaper and just go back and forth again at that 45-degree angle. And that will also help to set up the edges to be polished really nicely in our next step. Now, at this point, once our frets are perfectly crowned and the edges are rounded and we just have that little tiny sliver of Sharpie, what I will do is I will go back with my fret rocker rocker and check yet again that nothing has changed with the height of my frets. Now, if I do find that I'm getting a little more rocking than I did before I had all the frets crowned, then I will again just very lightly, again with a 600 grit, just side to side. And we're gonna be taking off so little material here because we've already crowned those back into a dome shape. It's just gonna take off the very little tip top. And again, the 600 grit, it's not gonna leave hardly any tool marks. And if it does, they are going to be parallel with the fret and they're gonna polish out really easily. Now, the next step that we're gonna do is polishing. And if you're doing just standard nickel silver frets, you can just go straight to the polishing wheel. And that's what we're doing here. And so that's a huge time saver, being able to go straight from the file to the polishing wheel, not having to sand through the various grits. That'll save you at least 30 minutes to an hour. I really feel the fastest polishing method is a Dremel tool with a cloth polishing wheel and brown polishing compound. And it also helps if you have a flex shaft remote kit for it. That way you don't have to hold the whole weight of the tool, just the end of the flex shaft. Now, I purchased my cloth polishing wheels and brown polishing compound at my local Harbor Freight. It's cheap, it's readily available, but if you don't have a Harbor Freight near you, I'm gonna drop some links to Amazon where you can get stuff similar to this. Now, to be the most productive with your polishing, I found that you want a low speed setting on your Dremel. Definitely don't use a high speed setting because we don't want to heat up the fret really hot, because once you heat it up, it could potentially cause the fret to expand and undo our leveling job. So use a low speed, and then I found pressing hard for a short amount of time heats up the fret less than if you do less pressure over a longer amount of time. And so that's going to help you polish out those deep tool marks just by pressing pretty hard, and then just make sure that you feel with your finger in between each pass that you're not overheating your fret. If you find that the fret is getting too hot for you to touch with your finger, you want to back off and let it cool down because, again, we don't want to overheat the frets. Now, typically, I don't actually tape off the fingerboard to protect it from the polishing compound, and the reason is because I actually put a coat of finish on my necks before I do this whole leveling, crowning, and polishing job. And that's because it helps protect the fingerboard from all these tools potentially. But I do put a coat of finish on there beforehand so that the polishing compound doesn't stain the fingerboard. And it just buffs out really easy with steel wool when I'm done. And as a part of the finishing process, I do need to buff in between coats with steel wool anyway. So as long as I'm doing that step, it doesn't bother me if I have to remove some polishing compound with it. Now, if you want to leave your fingerboard unfinished until you're done with your fret work, then you definitely want to protect it with some masking tape. And for me, it seems a lot easier to just use a single piece of masking tape on each side of the fret and just move it between each fret as you're polishing, rather than taking the time to tape off the whole fretboard. It just takes a long time to tape off the entire fretboard, and it's honestly a waste of masking tape. When you can just peel and stick your same piece over and over again, you can get, I don't know, 5 or 6 frets before you have to change out to new masking tape. And so that, again, just makes the whole process more efficient. But as you can see, I'm just buffing off that polishing compound with the steel wool. It just comes right off, no big deal. So once we have polished out all of the tool marks and removed all the Sharpie and all the polishing compound, it's time for, yet again, to check with our fret rocker to make sure nothing has changed. Make sure you haven't overheated any frets, caused them to expand or unseat from their fret slot, and just double check that everything is good and perfect and pristine. And your fret rocker should just glide right across the tops of those perfectly polished frets. And once you've confirmed that all your frets are still good, I will actually guarantee that you have a perfect plain neck. You can go ahead and install it and give it a setup and see how it plays. So to sort of put my money where my mouth is, this is the neck that we've been working on up until this point. And I don't know if the camera's gonna pick it up how low that action is, but that is a extremely low action. It's honestly too low. And people will probably say, well, how can you have action that's too low? Well, once you've played on an action that's too low, you would know, especially if you're a slap player for bass specifically. It's really hard to dig your fingers underneath the string for some of those pops and snaps. And so this is honestly too low, but I always like to start too low and then you can raise it up to taste from there. And so just gonna real quick play all the frets for you so you can hear that we have 0 fret buzz issues. So. But yeah, plays perfect, 0 fret buzz up and down the neck. Nice unresolved major 7 chord there. How jazzy of me. Anyway, this bass is done and beautiful and ready to ship to the person who ordered it. And I'm honestly very sad to see this one go, just like the last bass I built. One of the most beautiful basses that I've ever built. Now, lots of people ask me after a video like this how they can get their hands on one of my custom prototype basses. And I'm doing it basically all as pre-orders as of now, as I sort of work on my prototyping and work out the kinks in my manufacturing and stuff like that. So if you want to get in on a prototype model, just head to my website and sign up for my email list, gunsandguitars.net, and that email list will be used as the early bird list for when I open up my next round of pre-orders. I still have 7 more basses on this round that I need to finish up before I can take more pre-orders. So be looking for that in the next month or so, hopefully. And if you thought this video was helpful in getting you fast, foolproof fretwork, then check out this playlist right here of DIY hacks for guitar building. I'm Dan, this is Guns and Guitars, and I'll see you in those videos.